time in Bahrain and in Libya, followed by Spencer Platt, who was in Tunisia on the Libyan-Tunisian border. I'll begin with a short bio of Ron, who is an award-winning photojournalist and co-founder of VII Photo Agency. His work is published by magazines worldwide, numerous museums, galleries including the Louvre, the United Nations, the Council on Foreign Relations have featured his work. Ron has also appeared on ABC World News, BBC, CNN, NPR, Good Morning America, Charlie Rose Show, and photographed the unrest in Egypt, including Tahrir Square in Cairo earlier this year. Lynsey is an award-winning American photojournalist based in New Delhi, India, where she photographs for the New York Times, National Geographic, and Time magazine. In 2000, she traveled to Afghanistan under Taliban rule to document life and oppression under the Taliban. She has since covered conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Darfur, Congo, and shoots features across the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. In March 2011, she was taken captive along with 3 other journalists while working in Libya. Spencer Platt has been a photographer for Getty Images since 2001. He currently covers news stories in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, and won World Press Photo in 2006. He recently photographed inside Libya and captured images of some of the tens of thousands of guest workers from Egypt, Tunisia, Bangladesh, and other countries who have fled to the border of Tunisia amid fighting in Libya. All of us know each other personally, and it's going to be an interesting discussion tonight following their showing of their work. Afterwards, we'll throw it open for questions from the audience. Again, thank you for coming, and we'll begin now with Ron Haviv.
So after Bob's introduction, kind of myself, I'm sure many of you are also thinking, like, why are we still doing this kind of work where our colleagues are being killed and being captured? And there's no specific answer. I think each of us comes up with our own answer about why we're doing this. But over the last 20 years or so, we've had a number of instances where events are so momentous that they're affecting people around the world. Starting in 1989 with the Berlin Wall falling, 9/11, and now the Arab Spring, starting with Tunisia, moving through to Egypt and the following countries. To be able to witness these events, to be able to document these events, is an extraordinary thing, both as an individual in terms of a purely personal motive, to be able to witness history happening in front of you, but more importantly, to be able to be a photographer, to help explain to the world what's happening so people can understand it better, so information can reach the right people. These are really, I think, dreams that all journalists and photographers have when they begin this craft, to be able to document these events, these monumentous historic events. And so the question is trying to determine how are you going to do it and what you're going to do with it. For me, with the Arab Spring, it took me a few days to really understand what was happening in Egypt, in Tahrir Square. In the beginning, it seemed like it was possibly just going to be more demonstrations and eventually be suppressed by the dictatorship and go on its way, and the effects of Tunisia wouldn't take hold. But like many of you, I watched on television as the demonstrators battled their way into Tahrir Square and began their momentous sit-in and demonstrations. So by the 4th or 5th day, I hopped on a plane and went to cover what was happening there, along with many of my colleagues, meeting people in the airport, meeting people on the ground there. And I'm going to show you just some of the work that I shot over the course of the following 2 weeks until the night when Mubarak finally resigned and left. Covering Tahrir Square was a very difficult, logistically was very difficult. In some ways it was very easy because everything was happening kind of in front of you in a very small area. But at the same time, there was a real mix of people. Sorry. there was a real mix of people within the square. You had the demonstrators, the anti-Mubarak demonstrators. You had a few pro-Mubarak demonstrators sort of roaming around. And then you had the army, and you had the secret police. And as time went on, the Mubarak regime started to blame more and more the events that were happening on foreign intervention. And we, the media, represent that foreign intervention. So in certain places within the square, you would be safe and you'd be able to photograph the demonstrators protesting. But as journalists and photographers would sort of move around and often would be on sort of off on the outskirts, all of a sudden people would start to disappear. Plainclothes policemen would drag them off into the Egyptian Museum, which turned from this great tourist site into the headquarters of the secret police during this demonstration. And all of a sudden, you started to add a whole other kind of element to trying to cover this type of event. So you had hundreds of thousands of people at different times going up and down, different people illustrating their choices through signs and things, some, like as this with the Facebook, sort of tribute to Facebook. And trying to move in this, like, moving within these people is fine, but if you move closer to the tanks, all of a sudden as a photographer, if you lifted up your camera and pointed towards the soldier and the soldier didn't like you, all of a sudden you were under arrest and you disappeared. So as time went on, each day we would start to do a calculation of who made it and who didn't. Where is this person, where is that person? And you had journalists and photographers disappearing for days at a time, being beaten, blindfolded, interrogated, and then all of a sudden things changing drastically to where they were having tea with their captors. It was a very dynamic situation and a very confusing situation. And you were trying to really try to have an attempt to document what was going on and show the breadth of these demonstrations of terms of everybody from religious to non-religious, from male to female, from child to old person. And it was a difficult way to understand how to work because things were changing so quickly within a very small area, and rumors were constantly happening. So as a photographer, you have to really kind of always be trying to figure out where are the photographs, where do you need to be, what's going on, how to keep yourself safe. Things would change during the night, a lot of people would leave, then you would have to start to deal with like wandering around, like if you go down a side street, will you disappear, will somebody attack you? Photographers were being beaten up in the streets, while a street away, photographers were being hugged and told, thank you for coming and covering our story. One of the things that became very apparent to me during the battle for Tahrir Square was that it was almost it was a battle being fought with the tools that were used hundreds of years ago. What was amazing that for the most part, very little gunfire was used, and they were fighting mostly with rocks, some hand to hand when they got close enough, but rocks were really the primary tool. And in fact, at one point, the anti-Mubarak demonstrators built a catapult, and were actually using a catapult to throw rocks at the pro-Mubarak demonstrators. It was really quite an amazing scene to witness. So there were a lot of injuries, often to the head. A number of people were killed by stones, and occasionally there would be some sniper fire from the pro-Mubarak side as well. Well, if you guys want to turn the lights down off of the screen, if that's possible. So these are obviously difficult situations to cover as a photographer because there's lots of things flying in the air and it's kind of confusing and nobody really knows what they're doing. But you start to see as this went on for days and days, you started to see as they learned their sort of battle techniques and how to move forward and how to move back and how to protect themselves. And it really was an interesting observation of how different groups that were not organized became organized themselves for a common cause, where medical clinics were set up, supply lines were set up, And all these things really contributed to their ability to stay in the square, which eventually led to Mubarak falling. This man in the wheelchair I saw probably at every different sort of rock front line. He moved faster than anybody else, who was always there right in the center. And his dream, once Mubarak fell, was that he would be able to get a better wheelchair. And then you had very surreal moments where the different sides would come together. They would stop, they'd talk, they'd hug, they'd laugh, and then somebody would throw a rock, and it would all start again. This man is crying where a friend of his was actually killed by a sniper. They had snipers, that's the Hilton Hotel behind, and some snipers were shooting from the roof. Emotions ran very high. As time went on, people would be due to the rumors he's going to leave, they became very excited, filled with a lot of power and joy, and then they would find out he's not going to leave. It would go back and forth. And it was another interesting way to understand as they started to have a leadership, and these people would say, on every other day we'll call for large crowds, how they were able to keep the energy going of all the people. When you're dealing with thousands of people, and if you start to lose that and people give up or they dissipate, they all of a sudden lose their ability to keep pressure on the government. So it was really interesting to watch how that started, how they were able to keep that going through speakers, and this was done on a day that they christened the day of departure, where they really thought that this was the day that he would leave if they got enough people to come out and protest against him. This was the day that the camels came into the square. Probably some of the best pictures from this day were actually taken by Chris Hondros, who probably you've already seen many of his photographs. He was one of the few photographers that really was able to get the camels clashing. And this probably was a day that was considered a real turning point when people, especially I think people in the Egyptian military and other possible governments that were supporting Mubarak, witnessed these camels coming into the square and attacking people. They thought that this was like, it had gone too far. And then you start to see some really very odd things. This was a pro-Mubarak supporter who wandered into the middle of the crowd during a speech, and in fact, right in front of me and another photographer, started shouting pro-Mubarak slogans. And basically, in an act of, not suicide, but knowing full well that he was going to get beaten up. And he was, obviously he was attacked here, he's being shut up, and then he was dragged away by several people, and he was beaten. And I had befriended a demonstrator who was actually from New York, an Egyptian American who was like 7 feet tall. And I found him, and I got him to drag this guy out of the crowd, and they were able to hand him over to the army before he was killed. But emotions obviously can run very high in situations like this. This is another person, the older man in the middle they thought that he was a spy, and they were dragging him off. It's for me, one of the most scary situations is mob rule. When mobs are around, there's no control. Things are very, very dangerous. I would always much rather be at a front line of a military battle than ever be attacked by a mob. These are just different scenes from the front lines between the pro and anti-Mubarak demonstrators. This woman was looking for her lost child, who was arrested by the pro-Mubarak forces, and she was unable to find him. And again, this is sort of this kind of, they're fighting with firecrackers, stone